Whispering Shadows. Chapter 1. The Letter. Detective Jack Harper sat at his cluttered desk, a half-empty bottle of bourbon beside him, staring blankly at the thick envelope that had arrived earlier that morning. The shadows in his dimly lit office seemed to dance, whispering secrets he wished he could ignore. Jack's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the letter, a feeling of dread creeping up his spine. It had been 3 years since the Anderson case, the one that had shattered his life, his career, and his sanity. The case had left him scarred, both physically and mentally, haunted by nightmares that refused to fade. He had tried to forget, to bury the memories under a mountain of alcohol and late-night cigarettes, but the ghosts of that case still lingered in every corner of his mind. The envelope was unmarked, with no return address. The handwriting on the front was neat, almost elegant, as if whoever had written it had taken great care in forming each letter. Jack hesitated for a moment, then tore it open, pulling out a single sheet of paper. The message was brief, but it struck him like a punch to the gut. "I know what you did." Jack's heart raced as he read and reread the words. The sentence was simple, yet it carried a weight that threatened to crush him. Who could have sent this? And more importantly, what did they know? His mind raced back to the Anderson case. The gruesome murders, the endless nights of searching for clues, and the horrific discovery he had made in that cold, dark basement. There was no way anyone could know what had happened down there, what he had been forced to do. Jack shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away. He couldn't afford to lose himself in the past again. He needed to focus, to figure out who was behind this before it was too late. But deep down, a part of him wondered if it was already too late, if the shadows from his past had finally caught up with him. As he folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope, Jack noticed something else. At the bottom of the paper, almost imperceptible, was a set of initials, M.A. His breath caught in his throat. Could it be? No, it couldn't be. Mark Anderson was dead. Jack had seen to that himself. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows darker. Jack felt the familiar grip of panic tightening around his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that there was only one place he could start. He grabbed his coat and headed out the door, the letter clutched tightly in his hand. It was time to revisit the past, no matter how much it terrified him. Chapter 2. The Graveyard. The sky was a deep shade of gray as Jack made his way to Greenfield Cemetery, the cold wind biting at his face. The trees, twisted and barren, lined the narrow path like sentinels guarding the secrets buried beneath the earth. Each step felt heavier than the last as Jack approached the far corner of the cemetery, where the Anderson family plot lay. He hadn't been back here since the funeral, and he wasn't eager to return. The memories were still too raw, too painful. But if there was any chance that this letter was connected to Mark Anderson, he needed to be here. He needed to see for himself. The grave was simple, a modest headstone with Mark Anderson's name etched into the stone. Jack stood there for a moment, staring at the name that had haunted him for so long. Despite the chill in the air, sweat beaded on his forehead as he knelt down, running his fingers over the cold stone. "What the hell is going on?" Jack muttered under his breath, his mind racing. The letter, the initials, everything pointed back to this man. But how could it be? Mark was dead. Jack had watched the life drain from his eyes, had buried the secrets along with him. As if on cue, the wind picked up, howling through the trees, and Jack felt a shiver run down his spine. The shadows seemed to move, creeping closer, whispering just out of earshot. He forced himself to stay focused, pushing away the irrational fear that clawed at the edges of his mind. But then he saw it. A fresh bouquet of flowers, lying at the foot of the grave. The flowers were white lilies, Mark Anderson's favorite. They hadn't been there when Jack arrived, and there was no one else in sight. His heart pounded in his chest as he reached down to pick them up. Attached to the bouquet was a small card, the same neat handwriting from the letter scrawled across it. "Did you really think you could bury the truth?" Jack's blood ran cold. Whoever was behind this knew far more than he had feared. He dropped the flowers as if they had burned him, stumbling back from the grave. The shadows seemed to close in around him, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. He couldn't stay here. He needed to get out, to clear his head and figure out his next move. But as Jack turned to leave, something caught his eye. Movement in the distance, near the edge of the cemetery. A figure, cloaked in black, watching him. Before he could react, the figure disappeared into the trees, leaving Jack alone in the gathering darkness. The weight of the past was suffocating, pulling him deeper into the abyss. Jack knew that whatever was happening, it was just beginning, and he wasn't sure if he had the strength to face it. Chapter 3. The Confession. The drive back to Jack's apartment was a blur. His thoughts were a tangled mess, fear and paranoia gnawing at the edges of his mind. He replayed the scene at the cemetery over and over, trying to make sense of it all. The letter, the flowers, the mysterious figure. None of it added up, yet the one undeniable truth was that someone knew. He parked his car in the alley behind his building and climbed the stairs to his apartment, the cold seeping into his bones. As he fumbled with his keys, he noticed a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye, a shadow darting across the hallway. His hand froze on the doorknob. "Get it together, Harper," he muttered to himself, shaking his head, but the unease refused to leave him. His hand finally steadied and he unlocked the door, stepping into the familiar gloom of his apartment. He dropped his coat on the chair and poured himself a drink, needing something, anything, to steady his nerves. The bourbon burned its way down his throat, but it did little to calm him. Jack's eyes drifted to the old case files piled on his desk, a chaotic mess of papers, photos, and evidence from cases long closed. At the top of the pile was the Anderson case. He hadn't looked at that file in years, hadn't wanted to, but now he couldn't avoid it any longer. He needed to confront the demons that had been lurking in the shadows of his mind. Jack sat down, his fingers trembling as he opened the file. The photos were the worst. Images of the victims, their lifeless eyes staring back at him, each one a silent accusation. But there was one photo in particular that he couldn't bring himself to look at. The basement. He flipped through the pages, each one a reminder of the nightmare that had consumed his life. But something caught his eye, something that shouldn't have been there. A piece of paper folded neatly between the reports. It hadn't been there before. With growing dread, Jack unfolded the paper. It was another letter, the same handwriting, the same taunting message. "You thought you could hide it, but I know the truth. Meet me where it all began." Jack's heart pounded in his chest. Where it all began. The basement. The place where he had found Mark Anderson, where he had uncovered the horrifying truth. He had to go back there. He had to face whatever, or whoever, was waiting for him. But Jack knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed help, someone he could trust. And there was only one person who fit that description: Rachel. Rachel Clark had been his partner during the Anderson case, the only one who had stood by him when everything fell apart. They hadn't spoken much since, the case driving a wedge between them. But now Jack had no choice. He picked up the phone and dialed her number, his hands shaking. It rang several times before she answered. "Jack, is everything okay?" Her voice was cautious, concerned. "No, Rachel, it's not," Jack admitted, his voice hoarse. "I need to see you. It's about Anderson." There was a pause on the other end, and Jack could almost hear the wheels turning in her mind. "Anderson? Jack, that case is over. What's going on?" "I can't explain over the phone. Just meet me at the old warehouse on 6th. Tonight. Please." Another pause, longer this time. Finally she sighed. "All right, Jack. I'll be there. But this better be good." Jack hung up, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. He finished his drink in one long gulp, the alcohol doing little to dull the fear gnawing at his insides. Tonight, he would face the shadows of his past, and he wasn't sure if he would survive it. Chapter 4. The warehouse. The night air was thick with fog as Jack made his way to the warehouse on 6th. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual hum of the city muffled by the oppressive silence. Jack's footsteps echoed in the stillness as he approached the dilapidated building, its windows dark and broken, a relic of a time long past. He stopped at the entrance, the heavy metal door slightly ajar, as if someone had been expecting him. Jack hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, to leave this place and never look back. But he couldn't. Not now. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The warehouse was just as he remembered it, cold, dark, and filled with the stench of decay. The walls were covered in grime, the floor littered with debris. But it was the silence that unnerved him the most, the kind of silence that seemed to swallow sound and make the world feel smaller. He scanned the room, his eyes searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Just shadows and darkness. Jack's hand instinctively went to the gun at his waist, his fingers wrapping around the cold metal. He wasn't taking any chances. "Jack." The voice startled him and he spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Rachel stood in the doorway, her face a mask of concern and confusion. She stepped inside, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, her voice low but tense. Jack shook his head, trying to find the right words. "I don't know, Rachel. I got a letter, another one. It said to come here. I think someone's trying to mess with me, trying to drag me back into the Anderson case." Rachel frowned, her gaze sweeping the room. "And you think it's connected to what happened back then?" "I don't know what to think," Jack admitted, his voice strained. "But whoever it is, they know things. Things no one else should know." Rachel studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, let's figure this out. Together." Jack felt a surge of relief. Despite everything that had happened, he knew he could count on Rachel. They were in this together, just like they had been all those years ago. They moved deeper into the warehouse, the shadows closing in around them. Jack's mind raced with possibilities. Who could be behind this? And what did they want? But as they reached the center of the room, all thoughts were cut short. There, in the middle of the floor, was a single chair. And in that chair, bound and gagged, was a man. His eyes were wide with fear, his face pale and covered in sweat. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he recognized him. It was Mark Anderson. Rachel gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Jack, that's not possible. He's dead." Jack stared in disbelief, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Mark Anderson, alive. But how? He had seen the body, had buried the truth along with it. Before Jack could react, the lights in the warehouse flickered, then went out, plunging them into darkness. The air grew cold and the whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. Jack's breath caught in his throat as the shadows seemed to move, closing in around them. And then a voice, deep, cold, and full of malice, echoed through the darkness. "You thought you could bury the truth, Jack. But the truth always finds a way out." Chapter 5. The Revelation. Jack's blood ran cold as the voice echoed through the darkness, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The shadows pressed in around them, and he felt Rachel's hand grip his arm, her fear palpable. "Jack, what the hell is going on?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't answer, his mind racing as he tried to piece together the impossible. Mark Anderson was dead. He knew that, he had made sure of it. And yet, here he was, bound and gagged, fear etched into his features. But the voice wasn't his. Jack reached for his gun, his fingers brushing the cold steel as his eyes strained to see through the darkness. He had to stay calm, had to think. Whoever was behind this, they were playing a dangerous game and Jack wasn't about to lose. "Show yourself." Jack shouted into the void, his voice cutting through the whispers. "What do you want?" For a moment, there was only silence, the kind that pressed down on him like a physical weight. Then the lights flickered back on, casting a harsh, flickering glow across the warehouse. Mark Anderson still sat in the chair, but now his eyes were closed, his head slumped forward. Jack took a step forward, his gun raised, but Rachel pulled him back. "Jack, wait. This feels wrong. We need to think." But Jack's mind was already made up. He had come too far to back down now. He had to know the truth. He moved closer, his heart pounding in his chest, the air thick with tension. As he reached Mark, he hesitated, then slowly lifted the man's head. Mark's eyes fluttered open and he stared at Jack, a mixture of fear and confusion in his gaze. "Please, help me," he croaked, his voice weak, barely more than a whisper. Jack frowned, his grip tightening on the gun. "How are you alive? I saw you die, Mark. I buried you." Mark's eyes filled with tears, his body trembling. "I don't know. I don't remember anything. One moment I was in that basement and then, nothing. I woke up here tied to this chair. Please, Jack, you have to help me." Jack's mind spun. This couldn't be happening. But the desperation in Mark's voice, the terror in his eyes, it was real. Jack glanced back at Rachel, who was watching the scene unfold with a mixture of horror and disbelief. "Jack, we need to get him out of here," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Whoever did this, they're still out there." But before Jack could respond, the voice returned, colder, more menacing. "You're too late, Jack. The truth is already out. And now you'll pay for what you've done." The lights flickered again and the room plunged back into darkness. Jack felt a surge of panic as the whispers grew louder, filling his head with their insidious murmurings. He swung his gun around, trying to pinpoint the source of the voice, but it was useless. The shadows were alive, shifting, moving as if they were hunting him. "Jack." Rachel's voice cut through the chaos, pulling him back to reality. We have to go. Now. But as Jack turned to grab Mark, the lights flickered back on, and what he saw made his blood freeze. Mark Anderson was gone. The chair was empty, the ropes that had bound him lying in a heap on the floor. There was no sign of a struggle, no trace of where he had gone. What the hell? Jack whispered, his voice trembling. The fear that had been gnawing at him exploded into full-blown terror. He had been so sure, so certain that Mark was dead. But now everything was unraveling, and Jack felt like he was losing his grip on reality. Jack, we need to get out of here, Rachel urged, her voice sharp with urgency. Whoever is behind this, they're messing with your head. We have to figure this out, but not here. But before they could move, a low, mocking laugh echoed through the warehouse, sending a shiver down Jack's spine. You can't run from the past, Jack. It will always find you. And then, with a final flicker, the lights went out for good, plunging them into complete darkness. Chapter 6. The final confrontation. Jack and Rachel stumbled out of the warehouse, the oppressive darkness pressing in on them from all sides. The fog outside had thickened, turning the streets into a maze of shadows and mist. Jack's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear, the lines between reality and nightmare blurring beyond recognition. Rachel tugged at his arm, her voice a desperate whisper. Jack, we need to get somewhere safe. We can't stay out here. But Jack barely heard her. His thoughts were consumed by the impossible. Mark Anderson alive, the voice that haunted his every step, the shadows that seemed to follow him wherever he went. None of it made sense, and yet it was all too real. He stopped in the middle of the street, turning to Rachel with wild eyes. Rachel, I don't understand. Mark was dead. I was there. I buried him. How can this be happening? Rachel shook her head, her expression one of deep concern. Jack, I don't know. But whoever, or whatever, is doing this, they want you to lose control. They're trying to break you. We have to keep it together. Jack nodded numbly, trying to focus on her words. But even as he did, the whispers returned, faint but insistent, crawling into his mind like tendrils of darkness. He clenched his fists, fighting to stay grounded, to hold on to whatever shred of sanity he had left. Let's go back to my place, Rachel suggested, her voice steady. We can figure this out there. But before they could move, a figure emerged from the fog, standing in the middle of the street, blocking their path. Jack's heart leapt into his throat as he recognized the figure, the same cloaked figure he had seen at the cemetery. The figure stood motionless, shrouded in shadow, its face hidden beneath a dark hood. Jack reached for his gun, but the figure spoke before he could draw it, the voice cold and familiar. You can't escape this, Jack. You can't escape me. Jack's hand froze, his blood turning to ice. He knew that voice. It was the voice that had been tormenting him, the voice that had haunted his every step. But hearing it now, seeing the figure before him, a terrible realization began to dawn. Who are you? Jack demanded, his voice trembling with fear and anger. The figure remained silent for a moment, then slowly reached up, pulling back the hood to reveal a face that Jack never thought he would see again. It was Mark Anderson. But not the Mark Anderson he remembered. This Mark was different. His eyes cold and hollow, his skin pale and sickly, as if he had been pulled from the very depths of hell. You should have left well enough alone, Jack, Mark said, his voice low and venomous. But you couldn't, could you? You had to dig to uncover the truth. And now the truth has come for you. Jack's mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. Mark was dead. He had seen the body, had buried him. But now, standing before him, was the undeniable truth, a truth that defied all logic and reason. I don't understand, Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. How are you alive? Mark's lips twisted into a cruel smile. Alive? I'm not alive, Jack. Not in the way you think. You see, when you buried me, you buried more than just a man. You buried a secret, a darkness that couldn't stay hidden forever. Jack took a step back, the weight of Mark's words pressing down on him. What do you want from me? Mark's eyes burned with a cold fire. I want you to suffer, Jack, just like I suffered. I want you to feel the darkness that I felt, the despair that consumed me. And when you're at your lowest, when there's nothing left but the shadows, I'll be there to drag you down. The fog thickened, the shadows closing in around them. Jack felt the cold grip of fear tighten around his heart. This was it, the moment he had feared, the moment when the past would finally catch up with him. But then, through the haze of fear and confusion, Jack remembered something. The gun in his hand, the feel of the trigger beneath his finger. It was his last chance, his only chance. Without thinking, he raised the gun and fired. The shot echoed through the fog, shattering the silence. But when the smoke cleared, Mark was gone. The street was empty, the shadows retreating, the whispers fading into nothingness. Jack stood there, the gun still in his hand, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Rachel rushed to his side, her eyes wide with shock and concern. "Jack, are you okay?" she asked, her voice urgent. But Jack didn't answer. He stared at the spot where Mark had stood, his mind racing. Had he really seen what he thought he had seen? Or had the darkness finally consumed him? He didn't know. And that was the most terrifying part of all.